It's time for another Marvel list. This time it's 1996 as Marvel was staring down bankruptcy. Up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hey there, comic book community. Let's take another annual look at Marvel Comics, the top Marvel comics from 1996. And by this point in time, the list is getting fairly thin. Marvel had kind of gotten away from some of their youth-oriented comics that commanded big prices as back issues now, like the big books in 95 were Gargoyles, which only lasted 11 issues, and Earthworm Jim, which only lasted 3. And they were getting away from their traditional superheroes. Now, their traditional superhero titles hadn't really produced that much creative zeal in the 90s. Not a whole lot of new characters introduced. So there were two things. X-Men was in the Onslaught era in that books. And what Marvel did about mid-year was they launched Heroes Reborn, which was taking basically their Fantastic Four and Avengers characters, the non-X-Men characters, and non-Spider-Man, and putting them in an alternate universe and telling new stories. They brought Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld back from Image. Lee, with his Wildstorm imprint, were giving these characters kind of a new look, new life. And what Marvel did was they canceled many of their long-running titles. Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Avengers, Captain America, Thor. Thor had just reached 500 issues. Fantastic Four was just over 400. And after 30 some odd years of ongoing publication of those titles, boom, they were done. And so let's take a look at our top 10. Not a lot from Heroes Reborn on here. And number 10 on the list, Carnage, It's a Wonderful Life, which was the second one-shot that Carnage had this particular year. It's fairly scarce. It's approximately $110 in a CGC 9.8, and that's a lot lower CGC price for a number 10 book on the list than we saw most of the rest of the decade. It's about a $25 book raw. It didn't have a high print count, and generally speaking, and this is going to become important when we get to number 1 and then go to honorable mentions because there is an interesting book on this list. I'm looking for 2 sales in a CGC 9.8 over the course of the last year, or, as in the case of this book, a 9.6 sale that backs it up. So Carnage, It's a Wonderful Life had a $110 sale in December, and also in December, a 9.6 sale of $99. Generally speaking, for modern books from this 90s foil era, you're looking at probably a 2-to-1 ratio from the price of a 9.6 to a 9.8. So if a book's selling for $99 in a 9.6, we would expect it to sell for about $198 in a 9.8. Moving up to number 9 on the list, and it's Sensational Spider-Man number 0, in which Ben Reilly becomes Spider-Man. That sounds familiar. Anyway, this book sells for about $110 in a CGC 9.8 and $10 raw. There were 2 $110 sales in 2021, one in March and one in January. Interestingly, there was an alternate wraparound cover, and that had 2 sales in July in a 9.8. The wraparound sold, the 2 sales were for $911 and $1,000. Number 8 on the list, Sabretooth Special number 1, which pretty volatile. It's also about $110 in a CGC 9.8 and under $10 raw. There was a $100 sale last month in January, and in December sales of $75 and $200. So kind of all over the place. November, $75. So it's around a $100 book in a CGC 9.8, and it is Sabretooth's first solo series. We talk about the Heroes Reborn. One of the titles that they relaunched after they canceled its long run was Iron Man. Iron Man number 1, also very volatile sales. Only two 9.8 sales in the year, $52 in June and $199 in April. An average CGC sale of $126, and this is a book that sells for less than $5 raw. There are just a few people, I guess, that wanted that 9.8, and that's the prices that have been tracked on eBay. Number 6 on the list is X-Men number 53, which is the first full appearance of Onslaught. CGC average sales of $167. You could probably get it for about $10 to $15 in a high-grade raw copy. In January, this book sells rather frequently, and people are kind of speculating on all sorts of mutant titles. Sales in January have been between $124 and $164 in a CGC 9.8. There was a high sale back in July, right at the end of the height of the market, of $400. I don't think we're going to see it reaching those heights again. Number 5 on the list, and this is the first one-shot. We had It's a Wonderful Life as the second. Carnage Mind Bomb is the first solo Carnage book. That sells for an average of $171 in a CGC 9.8 and about $10 to $15 raw. It had this red hollow foil cover. It was the 90s. I think, you know, most people will say anything from the 90s forward is modern. That's 30 plus years now of comic books. The 90s were the foil era. You have gold, silver, bronze, copper, foil. I think it makes sense. The sales in December of $199 and $200, with a high sale in August of $275. Moving up to number 4 on the list, Amazing Spider-Man 410, the first appearance of Spider Carnage, in which Ben Reilly is possessed by the Carnage symbiote. That sells for an average of $180 in a CGC 9.8, and it's close to a $40 book in a high-grade raw. Again, this book has cooled off a little bit since the Venom 2 Let There Be Carnage movie was released. There was a sale of $139 in November. That's the most recent 9.8 sale. And the high sale back in September, before the movie came out, of $180. Moving up to number 3 on the list, Incredible Hulk 441, which is an average CGC sale of $192, $30 to $35 for a raw book. And it's really this Pulp Fiction homage cover with She-Hulk. That's what makes this a valuable book. We all know that, especially with Stray Dogs and some other independent titles, these alternate covers that homage movies, movie posters, and other movie advertising have become popular. This is back in the 90s. There was a little bit of that back then. There was a $214 sale in a CGC 9.8 in July and a $173 sale in June. Number 2 on the list is a collaboration between Marvel and Wizard Comics, Heroes Reborn number 1/2, which sells for an average of $197 in a CGC 9.8 raw copies. You could probably get for under $10. The most recent sale was $197 in January. Prior to that, the only other 9.8 sale, and I probably shouldn't have made my list then, was a $23 sale in October of 2018. This is a preview of Ricky Barnes, the daughter of Bucky Barnes, in this alternate Heroes Reborn reality. So, yeah, that's Heroes Reborn, number 2 on the list. And number 1 on the list, Venom Tooth and Claw number 1. Venom was getting miniseries after miniseries after miniseries at this point in time. And what makes this special, and the reason that it goes for about $258 in a CGC 9.8 and about $20 for a high-grade raw, is that it is this classic cover of Venom versus Wolverine. The high sale back in June of $350, and that's really the most recent sale, again, prior to the movie coming out. But you could probably get this on the dip now. There were sales in May of $160 and $180. Now let's go to the honorable mention, because the book that I'm going to mention first amongst the honorable mention hasn't had a 9.8 sale since 2020. And that is Resident Evil number 1. Based on the video game, it was a giveaway by Capcom. This is a book that I found in my collection. I don't know how I got it, never played the video game. My LCS owner at the time didn't like to give away a lot of free stuff, but I have it, and I have a really sharp copy. It sold for $600 in a CGC 9.8 back in October 2020, $499 in July of the same year. But more recently, in November of 2021, a 9.6 sold for $800. Very scarce book, very hard to find. So I'm trying to price the book out if I get it graded in high grade, what it's going to be. Let's look at a few other titles. Avengers Unplugged #5 is where Monica Rambeau becomes Photon. That's a book you're going to probably have to pay about $30 for. A lot of, especially in the summer, the Monica Rambeau speculation. The last 9.8 sale was a year ago, just over a year ago, in January of 2021 for $300, and just prior to that, a $200 sale in December of 2020. We know we're going to get more Monica Rambeau, and I do think she's going to play a significant role going forward in the MCU, not just in the Marvels. I think we're going to see her in other properties, and she's going to become kind of a big deal. Spider-Man 2099, #46, the final issue. The last sale back in April of 2020 in a CGC 9.8 was $188. You can probably get that for probably 10 to 20 bucks raw. Spider-Man The Lost Years #0 had a CGC sale back in September 2020 of $130. Star Trek X-Men, an interesting combination there. At this point in time, it was this year, Marvel acquired the rights to the Star Trek books, and they printed a lot of them. Voyager, I think Deep Space Nine, First Contact, Starfleet Academy, Star Trek. They did a lot of properties, and they crossed them over the X-Men. One 9.8 sale in April this year for $130. Another final issue was Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme #90, which was the final issue back in March. It sold for $110. Another honorable mention to a book that we've had on a previous list. Was it published in 2 years? No, it was also published by DC as part of the Amalgam line, and that's Legends of the Dark Claw #1. One 9.8 sale in 2021 in December of $105. You can probably get it for less than $10 raw. Of all the Amalgam books in which they combined two different characters, the most popular was the Legends of Darkclaw. There was also the Legends of Darkclaw. There's also the Darkclaw Adventures, which was more based on the style of the DC animated series, and it was a combination of Batman and Wolverine. And then I'm going to mention one other book because it's a hard to find book, and it's a book that hasn't sold in a CGC 9.8. It's only 12 pages. And it's only 4 by 5 3/4 inches, but it sells for about $50 raw, and that is Combo Man #1. Sort of based on the snack pretzel with, like, cheese, pizza, other fillings in it, and Combo Man. It was a one shot. He did appear somewhere else another time, but he kind of has a combination of all different Marvel characters, like Hulk's hair and Captain America's bicep or something. And that's probably not the part of an anatomical part of Captain America you choose today. So yeah, that's a book that is, its size makes it hard to find, and it probably makes NFL Super Pro look like Watchmen. So in the end of 1996, in December of 1996, the Marvel Entertainment Group declared bankruptcy. And we could see that Marvel was having, I think, creative issues at the time. There wasn't a lot of exciting new content. I think they got hurt by changing their trade dress. For decades, they had the character box for each of the books. It was kind of distinctive, and they got away from that. I personally, I'm not a big fan of the look of the Marvel books from the late 90s era. There was just something different about it. And I think they were trying to chase something that they saw that some of the independent publishers like Image and Malibu, who they acquired, maybe even Valiant at the time, had, rather than sticking with what was successful for them. Spider-Man kept on trucking, and we can see that the most popular characters that have come out of this era are Spidey and Venom and Carnage. And the mainstream characters, the characters that we really associate with the MCU for the first, 4 phases, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, the Avengers as a whole, not a lot was happening with these characters at this time in the 90s. Marvel Entertainment Group was bought out by Toy Biz the next year and became, I think it was Marvel Enterprises. And they were eventually saved by the movies, which has been a problem over the last several years because in order to create money, they had to sell the rights to the films to Sony, to Fox, and let Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four go. And that was kind of how they managed to avoid bankruptcy, or to avoid just completely shutting down at the time. I remember there are even stories, and there are parallels now, because there's a lot of buzz among people that I talk to in comic books that I don't think it's a big secret that Warner Brothers isn't really a fan of the comic books. Periodicals, magazines, newspapers are disappearing, being replaced with digital media. And what really is of value to these companies like Disney and Warner Brothers is the intellectual property, these copyrights that they've managed to maintain for the last 80 plus years. So for Warner Brothers, there's value in just the names of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, and so on, in terms of producing movies, TV series, toys, video games. And I think both companies are really using the comic books as testing grounds for new ideas. It's really their research and development. That's a little bit different than what we as comic book fans and collectors feel about it. We have, grown to be associated, to be connected to the characters in this medium. So I remember at the time in the 90s, people were talking, well, maybe DC will buy the Marvel characters. And now I'm hearing the opposite. I don't see Disney buying the DC characters. I think they're worth too much money going forward to Warner Brothers and whoever owns Warner Brothers. But at the time, that wasn't really considered a thing, because it wasn't until really X-Men and Spider-Man came out as major motion pictures that there seemed to be a viability in creating movies. A lot of the movies that Marvel had created didn't do well. The Dolph Lundgren version of The Punisher, and they had kind of outsourced their properties like Captain America, the one that starred Matt Salinger, and the terrible Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie that was just kind of an ash can edition of a movie. Wouldn't have given anybody the glimpse that movies would have become the savior of these comic book properties, and that they would have become multi-billion-dollar enterprises. But that's where we stood. Marvel was on the brink of disappearing in the late 90s, and there were many doubts about what their future would look like. Not a lot of the books are really well remembered. Some of them are starting to accrue value in the late 90s because they're scarce. Even as we get into the Spider-Man with the Spider Carnage, the print run was much lower than it had been just a few years earlier. So I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind when we're looking at back issues. We're starting the boom in the early to mid 90s is becoming the crash now of the late 90s. So until next week, we're going to be looking at Marvel in 1997. And this is Jim saying until then, enjoy your comics.